right, and welcome as we continue to see some folks signing on. This morning, this afternoon, this evening, we welcome everybody to our August Global Sport Matters Live, a show where we bring together experts to discuss issues that matter in the world of sport. We always like to take just a minute at the beginning to acknowledge that the lands where our Global Sport Institute and Arizona State University sit belong to the Maricopa and Pima peoples. We are very excited for today's show, which is actually a part of our newest digital issue from the Global Sport Matters called The Risk and Reward of Globalized Sport, which includes articles, podcasts, and so many different stories that will continue dropping all throughout the month. So inside of the issue right now, which we are dropping into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen for you, we have stories that are investigating the true costs of the Olympics, examining the future of American sports betting from examples abroad, a deeper look at the real reason why the sport of breaking will debut at the Olympics in Paris, and so much more. We also want to make sure that you don't miss the video chat with Global Sport Institute's CEO, Kenneth Shropshire, about the issue. We are dropping all of these links into the chat and will continue engaging with you throughout the discussion today in this chat box. We encourage your questions and comments into our Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. If you just click on the Q&A, which is just in the toolbar at the bottom. So stick around after today's conversation for a clip of The Sea is Our Garden, a short documentary by Pamela Johnson focused on organizers like Black Kids Swim and Black Girls Surf, who are working across borders to reimagine a new and more positive relationship between the African diaspora and the sea. So now we're onto our show, and we are so excited to welcome today's guests. We have Andres Martinez, Professor of Practice in the Cronkite School at Arizona State University, and he is also the editorial director of Future Tense, which is a Washington, D.C. based ideas journalism partnership between ASU, Slate Magazine, and New America. We also welcome Lori Okamura, the international technical official at Tokyo 2020 Paralympic Games, the executive board member of Angel City Sports, which works with adaptive athletes, adaptive youth athletes, and former board chair of the USA Volleyball team. We also have Fred Turner, who is the executive director at Beyond Sport, an organization creating sustainable change through sport. And our wonderful host for today's conversation, Eric Legg, associate professor within the School of Community Resources and Development here at Arizona State University. And I don't want to take any more time away from this conversation, but again, please do engage with us, follow along with the chat, as well as the Q&A box, add any questions and comments there. And with that, Eric, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Kendall. So we have an amazing group with us today, so I want to just dive right in. And I want to start broadly by getting a sense of where we are today in terms of sport globalization. And Andres, I want to start with you in a topic that I know is near and dear to your heart, soccer, or we should probably say football, since we're talking about global sport today. Let's talk about the Super League. So this was an example of global sport where fans said, wait a minute, we don't want that. So can you give us a little insight in the Super League and what happened there?
Sure, and it's great to be here. I'm really thrilled to be part of this conversation. And speaking of football or soccer, today is the opening of the Premier League season. So I've got my Arsenal jersey on, and we'll be watching the game after we're done here. Yeah, so I mean, stepping back, Eric, one of the things that has fascinated me, and relates to the overall framing of this conversation today, is the acceleration of globalization in sport, even as we've seen people rethink globalization in other areas of life, particularly politics, right? And so England provides a dramatic example, probably the most dramatic case study of this disconnect, where you had the top division of English football, the Premier League, become the most globalized domestic sports league anywhere on earth. And that process accelerating even against the backdrop of Brexit and other instances where people were saying, wait a minute, we want to reassert the importance of national boundaries. And so a couple of years ago, with the support of our Global Sport Institute, I started exploring this question of whether the acceleration, the globalization of sport would give way to the reassertion of nationalism in politics and in culture, or whether sport would continue to be an outlier and sort of the leading edge of the spear for globalization, and maybe like one of the I think that has proven to be true. Nobody's rethinking the globalization of the Premier League, despite what's happening around globalization's fate in other contexts. And one of the things that's been really interesting is, as for a number of factors that we probably don't have time to explore right now, the English league did go from being one of the, not the strongest by any means league in what's sort of the world's default sport. It catapulted to the lead position in terms of its attractiveness to players, to corporate sponsors, to investors, and became kind of like the world's all-star league. And leagues in Italy and in Spain have seen their relative status to vis-a-vis the English league erode over time. And what we've seen in sport more broadly, but certainly in football and in soccer, is this is an industry, if we can call it that is only now going through a process that we saw other industries and economic arenas go through, which is that it's now being decoupled from particular places, right? I think, and we always felt like sport would, the operation of sport entities at the professional level, it would always be different, right? This is not selling Coca-Cola or beer or, pick your consumer product, that it had to be grounded in a place, and the ownership of that had to be of that place. And what we've started to see in the last 20 years is a sort of conglomeratization. It's a word too big, I can't say it. And the sort of transnationalization of this industry, just like we've seen it in other sectors of the economy throughout the last century, right? And so we now have cross-border investments, and we're now in a time, not that long ago, it would have been unimaginable for the citizens of Manchester or Liverpool, and I'm sure Fred knows this better than I from where he sits, it would have been unimaginable for them that their storied community asset of their football club could be acquired by an owner sitting in Abu Dhabi or Boston, right? So, and yet people often say this is kind of capitalism run amok, or we're getting too much driven by the market. What's interesting, though, is that the motives as to why people are making these cross-border investments in sport aren't all market driven. And that has created a lot of friction and tension in this sort of consolidating global marketplace for sport that then was accentuated by the pandemic crisis to the business. And so what I mean by that is you have this wave of US investors. 3 of the tops of the biggest English clubs are now owned by Americans. Arsenal, the team I root for, is owned by the Kroenke family, which also owns the Los Angeles Rams and other sports teams in the US. Manchester United is owned by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers owners. Liverpool by the Fenway Sports Group and the family that owns, the prime investor owns the Boston Red Sox as well. These owners from the US see an opportunity, right? If I am John Henry and I own the Boston Red Sox, I could spend the rest of my life trying to get people in Thailand to be interested in baseball and sell them, Red Sox paraphernalia. Or it's far more easy to acquire a global brand like Liverpool and bring my smarts on how to operate a sports team and the marketing and all the analytics that go into, recruiting and assessing talent. And just think of Liverpool as kind of more like my international global business, right? And because this is a business that's transitioning from local, almost like philanthropies, where in the old model, if you were in England, you're the sort of local business leader who had done well was supposed to pay back by taking over the local team and treating it as a philanthropy, right? So this new class of American owners that are investing heavily in European football, they see that they can create more rational businesses and make money and commercialize the game in a way that it hadn't been in the past. The tensions and the problems arise from the fact that other people that they're competing against from elsewhere in the world don't have the same motivation, right? So we have some competing clubs that are projects of a state, right? So, the Qataris are investing a lot into European football, not because the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund sees itself as already being an established entity that runs, sports franchises, but because it's trying to brand Qatar and associate itself with the soft power of sport. And then you still have some teams that are owned by the collective, right? And in the old days, when all ownership was local, the clubs in Europe that had the deepest resources were the traditional clubs like Real Madrid and Barcelona and Bayern Munich that were owned by literally hundreds of thousands of members. And so you still have these three different business models, and it creates a lot of dislocation because if I'm one of these American investors, I don't want to spend, more to compete than my revenues coming in, but that's not necessarily going to be the mindset of the Qataris, the Emiratis who own Manchester City, or Roman Abramovich, Putin's crony that owns Chelsea. So amidst all this dislocation and this anxiety that was occurring among other European clubs about, seeing England pull ahead, and then on the other hand, American owners who are less, invested in all of the tradition and history of the game and want to maximize profit, there was this perfect storm that occurred this spring where the biggest clubs from different countries said, we can maximize our revenues if we just play each other every week, right? Juventus, which is a big Italian team that's been owned by the Fiat conglomerate, and they're like the big team in Italy, and Real Madrid and Barcelona, and then 6 of the English big clubs said, let's create the Super League. And it was very offensive to, surprisingly to the fans of those clubs too, but especially to, the other teams in this domestic league. It was sort of another step in this idea that we can sort of unmoor ourselves from these local roots. In this case, the domestic leagues in each country. You already have competitions every year that are European-wide, as I'm sure most of you know, where the top teams from each country then go and play in a separate tournament, the European Champions League. But you have to qualify for that, and it's sort of separate. And this idea of a Super League was seen as a sort of coup, where we're going to take advantage of this moment where teams are, the finances of the game are suffering, and the rich are just going to get richer and leave behind everybody else. They did not read the room well in terms of what was happening. A lot of the blame was placed on these American investors as sort of like these, carpetbaggers that came in and all they want to do is maximize their income, and they don't want to play in this kind of risk-filled environment that we don't have in the States, where you might be relegated to a lower league. But just to make it quickly, the point of my piece was to say, actually, when you look beyond the kind of optics of some of this and the fact that JP Morgan was providing financing and all this, a lot of what was driving the Super League was the desperation of financially troubled teams in Italy and in Spain, who do worry that if they don't create a Super League that they're going to play in, the Super League that is sort of leaving the station is the English league, and that's going to be, I think, now the sort of the next story. And I could talk infinitely about this, but I realize this is sort of an opening salvo, and I don't want to take up more of the time. But so there's a lot going on, and it's fascinating. But I would say that the pandemic has only accelerated a lot of the globalization that we had been seeing in sport beforehand. And I didn't know that that was necessarily going to prove to be the case, but I think it is.
Andreas, thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack there, and I took some notes that I'm hoping we're going to be able to come back to. But I want to bring our other panelists into the conversation. And Lori, we'll start with you. You've been involved in sport at the Olympics, Paralympics, president of USA Volleyball. So what's your view of sport globalization?
Well, I think that, we can't talk about the globalization of sport today without talking about the pandemic. And as Andreas, alluded to, I think the pandemic has in a lot of ways accelerated some of the trends that perhaps were already in place. And, but also it's created some additional barriers or identified, some additional barriers. On the barrier side, I think with the Olympics just having finished up and the Paralympics, just a little bit more than a week away, certainly anybody who watched or consumed content, you can consider yourself a globalist, right? Cheering for your home team, cheering for someone else who had a good result. I think what we saw a lot of the pandemic exposed a lot of the common challenges, that athletes that are involved in global sport have to endure, whether it's training, travel and training, mental health, right? And safeguarding, how to keep athletes safe. All of these issues sort of came to the forefront and were escalated or maybe highlighted a bit more because of the pandemic, but still they were always an issue, right? In global, this is always an issue in global sport, right? I think that what we're seeing now is the interconnectivity of sport, right? Whether you're a track athlete in Europe or a track athlete in Asia, your preparation, your needs, right, for training and your barriers in terms of travel, right? When travel shuts down, like everybody's stuck wherever you happen to be, right? And part of that globalization is you had a lot of athletes training in countries that were not their native countries, and getting either stuck there or having to be really quickly, to pack up and having to be sent back home, wherever home, would be. So I think that what we're seeing now is this sort of flushing to the surface, right, of all these challenges that perhaps existed, already, but now are magnified, by the fact that it really is true that something that happens in one country is going to severely impact, the athletes, the fans, the companies, the sponsors in another, right? With global events being canceled, for example, we were talking earlier about, some of the national or international federations at the time that the pandemic hit, let's say around January, of 2020, this was before the Olympics and the Paralympics were postponed. There was a big question as to, okay, how severe, is this potential pandemic? Will we need to quarantine? What will happen with travel? What will happen with events? And I know from some of the firsthand experience, but also some shared experiences with colleagues, you had cancellation of events almost instantaneously, right? You had teams that were actually en route to an event, to try to qualify for the games, that finding out once they land or just as they're boarding the plane that there's a travel ban in effect because of this pandemic. So I think from a global perspective, right, we have now discovered, like, what is the interconnectivity, right, between not just what happens in our own countries, but what happens in others. Certainly, if you look at the trickle down, analysis of it, it didn't just affect elite athletes and professional athletes and Olympians and Paralympians. It affected the kids in our own communities, right? Whether you're a young football player in Italy and your whole field has been quarantined and you're not able to go outside your house or your apartment, or if you're a little league player in the United States and Little League World Series is canceled, or all of your events at the neighborhood park, which is closed, have been canceled, right? I know in volleyball it was very confusing for a lot of club programs, because you had some states in the U.S. that were shut down and kids couldn't play, and you had other states that were open and kids could play, but they had nobody to play against, right? Because everyone else was in quarantine. So certainly, the barriers, which were both cultural, and commercial, right? And the effects of which we haven't really been able to fully, examine, just because we're just beginning to reopen, right? We're just beginning to get back to it. But on the plus side, And this is something where I'm really excited to have Fred and Beyond the Sport as a part of this conversation, or Beyond Sport as part of this conversation, because on the plus side, from a global perspective, what has emerged is the importance of the athlete voice, right? And especially in all of the challenges I mentioned before with the travel and training, providing support to each other, whether it was through their national federations, international federations, the focus on mental health, certainly, which is part of global sport, right? That is a huge part, as we have seen, with the Olympics and whatnot, but also safeguarding. How important is the athlete voice in making sure that, especially during a pandemic, that those who are the most vulnerable are identified, protected, have resources, have an outlet, right? Which normally their outlet would be participating outside or being in sport or whatnot. That could also become a barrier and a real threat, right, to their safety. But the athlete voice certainly emerged, I think, in my opinion, as a key unifier, for global sport. It always has been, but I think now more than ever, the awareness of how important the athlete voice is out there, right? And one example is, I was just reading that Beyond Sport announced their youth advisory board, right? And when before have we ever put emphasis on the kids, right? The kids know what's going on, right? The kids are going to save us, especially the skateboarding kids and everyone else. But I think that that to me has been one of the most significant points. And where are we now, right, with sport globalization? Well, we are now at the point that we're starting to listen, right, to the athletes, and the younger they are, the more information we're able to glean from them as well.
Lori, thank you. You're ahead of me a little bit. I was going to ask Fred about his youth advisory board at some point, but let's switch to Fred here. So we've been talking primarily about elite level sport and Premier League, although Lori introduced youth leagues and athlete voice to us. Fred, Beyond Sport comes at this from a community grassroots level. So why don't we just start by you telling us about Beyond Sport and how Beyond Sport sees sport as a vehicle to change the world.
Yeah, and it's great to be here and awesome listening in for those first 10, 15 minutes. And that piece around sort of sport and sport being a microcosm of society really comes to life when you have these conversations. And there's certainly opportunities and threats with that. But on a sort of optimistic side, as you alluded to, Laurie, Beyond Sport, we're a grant-making foundation, and we support initiatives and generate ideas and partnerships that use sport with intent to address the most pressing issues that we see in society. And we look at sport sort of broadly through sort of two lenses, and see both, when used authentically and in collaboration, as having huge potential for impact. And we've spoken a lot about the sort of in-sport piece so far. So, that piece around the microcosm of society and how many of the issues we see playing out in society also playing out in sport. And so we do a lot of work with teams, leagues, athletes, federations, and corporates on firstly understanding what role they're playing, their influence, their power, how they personally view their role within society. And that can be from their communities to their fans, to their stakeholders, to their shareholders, and how can we help educate them and enhance what more they can do in that space. And certainly the conversations we've had around community football clubs becoming global brands, what does that mean? What are the opportunities there? And the likes of the Olympics and the athlete activism angle. These conversations are appearing more and more, and we'll certainly get onto the private sector as well a bit later on. And then the second area is sort of the through sport angle, and the power of sport when used with intent as a tool and a hook to engage youth, young people, and create positive impacts on their lives. And we use the UN Sdgs in many ways kind of as our North Star, really. It gives us a guidance on where those macro issues sit. And I'm sure many of you have looked into them. They're big issues on very large scales, hence being created by the UN. But they have key indicators within each one. And the key for us is to take that global context and then apply it locally, and to use those indicators that exist within that framework to shape the work we do and to understand the needs of the communities we're supporting, and how we can bring both funding, of course, and capacity building to these organizations to be more sustainable and to enhance the work that they're doing. So it's sort of a combination of the two. And our history is past 12 years, we've supported over 400 what you call NGOs on the ground around the world that are leveraging sport as a tool or a hook. So using sport, not just in and of itself, but as a tool for education, for conflict resolution, for messaging around gender equity, racial justice, and provided them with a range of grants and capacity building. And I guess bringing that back around to the first point of the in-sport is we can leverage that understanding of that grassroots work and the authenticity that that's providing to communities, and leverage that to engage with the more organizations within the dynamic of sport, to do just what I said around sort of understanding, enhancing, and really sort of calling on these organizations to understand that they have a role in society, and a responsibility to act. And Laurie's mentioned it, and Andres mentioned it as well at the start. I think it's one thing that the pandemic has raised is that those that were disproportionately underserved and prejudiced have been disproportionately impacted through the pandemic. And that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. So to finish on a positive note, I think it's one thing the pandemic has done is heightens people's awareness of these injustices and prejudices, and we have an opportunity to rebuild better. And sport is a absolutely crucial tool to do that within our communities.
Thanks, Fred. I want to tease this out a bit about sport and sustainable development goals, because I imagine someone listening might say, what on earth does sport have to do with the UN Sustainable Development Goals? So I realize that could be a whole conversation, but maybe, Fred, you could just give an example. What role does sport have in the SDGs?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally the SDGs are guidelines, they're guiding points. You know, many of the issues that you see across the goals are, you know, we are familiar with, but obviously the research and the indicators and the targets that have been set give organizations, you know, a guiding point to align to and understand that taking action is crucial to achieve these goals. And so I think, you know, that point around sport being a microcosm of society, organizations within sport can't get away with not taking a stance now. You know, if you're a neutral, you know, if you're acting neutrally, then, you know, you're almost causing more damage through that process. And so I think the role that sport has is to understand that every organization has a role and has a community that it is working with in some capacity, whichever way you look at it. And so we absolutely see that the diversity across the public, private, and third sectors aligning to these issues and understanding the issues that are at play within their communities, and taking a stance is absolutely crucial. Now, the projects on the ground that are doing this work invariably are aligned to these issues naturally because they're the issues their communities are facing. That sort of education in terms of where we've seen a development world shift in the past few years is to more proactively speak about how they're aligned to the UN SDGs. But really that has to be also led by the funding and the private sector and the role and the understanding that they're playing. And I think there has certainly been a challenge we've seen, and it's very much geographically based on how organizations, you know, funding and teams and leagues in the professional side, understanding their role and how they can align to and leverage these targets collectively, because essentially these are about, you know, collective impact and working together to achieve more. So I think personally, I think there's a challenge to them. They're so large that distilling them down to say, right, here's my organization, be it large or small, here's where I take a stance. And you can see that with climate action and sustainability organizations saying, where do I start? Start somewhere. And I think with the SDGs, there's a framework there that people can align to and start somewhere.
Yeah, great. So I want to move now and talk a little bit about sport and money and kind of the commodification of sport. And Andreas, I'm going to come back to you. So you're in media. What is the role of media in sport globalization? And then kind of a sub question to that, because I don't want to lose it. You had said something about the decoupling of place. What role does sport play in the decoupling of, or I'm sorry, what role does the media play in the decoupling of sport from place?
Well, I think professional sports that have large followings are media content almost more than they are anything else. And I think this has been an evolution, and it's now a reality. I mean, we just watched, I mean, some of us, fewer than usual, but many of us watched an Olympic Games that took place primarily because it is a global media event. This was an Olympics that was not necessarily, that was resisted to some extent, to a large extent, and Laurie would know far more about this than I, by its host, right? This was sort of an offshore Olympics. It took place in a bubble, disconnected from its host city, a year late, and the imperative reason why it had to take place was because ever since the first Olympics in Tokyo in 1964, the audience is a global TV audience. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad the Olympics took place, but let's not be confused as to why it took place. And this tension, you see it also in I mean, I think Americans are more comfortable with this idea that our pro sports are held for TV audiences, and the fact that there are people in the stands in that community are they're kind of part of the show, right? But we're not confused in the US that, an NFL game is scheduled for the TV audience, and that's really the driver, and that's what's bringing the money to pay the big salaries. In Europe, I think there's more cultural tension around this reality. It has become the reality, but people still haven't quite, there's still a bit of denial, and there's a lot of tension in European domestic soccer leagues about what role are the people in the stands playing? And again, the pandemic accelerated the reckoning because you had a prolonged period of time where you did not have the local fans in the stands, and the games had to go on. And it was clearly because of the imperative of the money coming in from media, from TV, right? I mean, so you can't understand the development of any professional sports league, or even the Olympic movement or collegiate sports in the US, which, we can have a separate debate as to whether that's professional or not. But you can't understand those developments without seeing it as a TV phenomenon. I mean, TV explains why the NFL overtook baseball as the main sport in the United States. It also helps explain this rise of the Premier League that I was talking about in Europe, when, in the 1990s, Rupert Murdoch needed compelling content to go up against the BBC and ITV. And so that's what creates this inflow of new money for English football. And it so happened that he had satellite TV across Asia that also needed that. So, again, I think it's a good question, because I think you can't underestimate the extent to which, this is all driven by media, for better or worse.
And when I think about media and sport, I can't help but think of esport right now. And what I know about esport, which is admittedly minimal, I think a lot of it is, I'm going to say Call of Duty. I could be very wrong, but not necessarily what we think of as sports. It's not people playing Madden or MLB Live. Did sport miss the boat? Did traditional sport miss the boat here?
I think we could engage in a lot of sort of semantic debates about what is a sport, what isn't a sport. I think, when you look at the success of Twitch and its experience with esports, I think traditional sports are going to be more resistant to trying, what they initially might see as sort of gimmicks. But I do think they're learning from the rise of esports. And I think given technology changes in how we consume media, we are going to start seeing different ways in which we can interact with the content. It's going to be less of a passive, you started seeing this with like some of the NFL playoffs last year where you could watch the Nickelodeon feed, you could watch the, there are modest steps in that direction. But I would be hesitant to say that traditional sports have missed the boat, only because I think given the fragmentation of audiences in the consumption of TV writ large, live sport is one of the last types of content that could still aggregate mass audiences. If you look at the 10 most watched telecasts in the United States last year, 8 of them were sporting events, and the other 2 were also not scripted TV. They were like the Masked Singer finale, which in a way you could say is kind of like a sport, right? It's a live contest, and that would not have been the case 20, 30, 40 years ago, where, sitcoms would typically have, more than 10 million people watching, much like an NFL game. All of those audiences have disappeared. So there's been a lot of talk, for example, about the plummeting ratings for the Olympics. And yet NBC brought in more revenue from advertisers than it did in Rio when it had 40% more viewers, because each one of those individual viewers is more valuable to the media company, because it's just much harder to find those size, large crowds to pitch to, because all of scripted content is migrating to streaming far faster than sport is. So it's a kind of nuanced, mixed picture, and I think this is still a pretty great time to be selling media rights if you're a sports league or a sports team.
So Lori, Andreas brought up the Olympics. So let's go to you. You're our Olympic expert. So Olympics are often idealized, at least, to promote unity, national pride, sportsmanship, all these great things, but there's a cost to them. I've seen estimates that Tokyo costs up to $35 billion. There are websites out there that exist that just show pictures of now dilapidated sport facilities that used to be Olympics. What's the future of the Olympics? Have they just become so commodified that that's it? Or is there a larger, more positive social role for them?
I think, and going back to our whole topic about globalization, I think that unfortunately, because of the conditions, of the pandemic and the Olympics and Paralympics upcoming, having to be staged in, such unprecedented and tremendous circumstances, we lost sight and we lost visibility of some of the good things that can come with a large sport event, not just the Olympics, Paralympics, but things like World Cup and World Championships and, large scale sporting events, are not just about the moment that the event takes place, right? And the audience, that's immediately focused on the competition, the finals, the semifinals, the medals and whatnot. Some of the benefit and a great deal of benefit, from events, especially like the Olympics and Paralympics, are some of the social and community programs that can come before, during, and after. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see a lot of the during, because a lot of sponsors were not able to activate, and sponsors that are part of the Olympic and Paralympic family, and those that are not. Individual sponsors of the athletes that are still considered part of the game's production. I mean, they were not able to activate at all. And we're talking about clinics and social programs and things that we don't often, if you're not working in this space, maybe you're not often going to connect the dots between some of those programs. I live most of the time in Los Angeles, and I think the city of Los Angeles is one example of how a legacy can be built, especially for communities, in terms of parks and facilities, but also participation for young people, and folks that maybe they saw a match or a game or something on TV during the Olympics, and that, oh my gosh, like I didn't know that surfing was an Olympic sport. Like I'm going to go out and see if I can, learn how to surf. Or I didn't know skateboarding, was an Olympic sport. I'm gonna go check out if I can, take lessons somewhere. My daughter or my son, can take lessons. So I think, unfortunately, because of the circumstances, we didn't get to see yet, a lot of the benefit, right, the sort of like, associated benefit that an Olympics or Paralympics can have. Certainly the commercialization effects were minimized, right? I mean, they're already somewhat minimized during during an event like the Olympics, because there is no commercialization inside the venue in terms of signage, but there certainly is a ton of commercialization taking place in the streaming, the broadcast, the outer venue, and how we consume content now as an audience is very different. Talking about globalization, it's like before we used to have to huddle around the TV waiting for that live broadcast. But now, and one of the things that I saw with a lot of sports, and this was, to me, very obvious with such a drastic change. Or what, a lot of people logging on to the apps, right? Whether it's the Olympic apps or the the streaming apps, trying to consume this content live as it was happening. And then depending on the result, maybe they tuned in later to the broadcast and rewatched it, right? Either in the agony or the joy of the result. So how we consume content has really changed. And that again leads to, some things that Andreas was talking about as far as the importance of the media role in all this. How do we tell the story when most of the world might have already seen, the ending, right? They might have already seen the result, right? A live result, and 12 hours later it comes on TV. Well, I've already seen it because I picked up my phone and I watched it, in real time. But getting back to, some of the benefit that I think we're missing out on. I mean, there's a lot of money, if we're talking about money and movement, there's a lot of money that is invested, in the communities and cities where Olympics are hosted. There's a lot of money invested in communities of the countries that participate, in the games. It doesn't necessarily overshadow some of the cons, to hosting. I mean, the cost, $35 billion, I think. However many years ago when they were awarded the bid, I think Tokyo had estimated it was going to be something like 12 billion. And I think the whole committee blanched, at that number. But $35 billion, and how much of that, what percentage of that was due to contingencies, for the pandemic, or and then not having any live fans, not having any tourism benefit, which is usually a huge motivating factor, for a city to even get into the bid process in the first place, is what type of tourism will this generate, for our city, for our country. And Japan really, was one of those beautiful locations that was kind of banking on that, very early on in the process. And they got practically zero, of that, except I think there was one athlete who tried to defect or tried to run away, and he got to see a little bit of the country, but not very many other people, got to enjoy that same benefit. So definitely, I think, the strain on the infrastructure, and again, due to the pandemic circumstances, the majority, I think, of the strain was due to the pandemic. But is it getting to the point where the cost of staging a world event like this is overshadowing, the needs of the local community? Or we might be at that point. We might be at the point of critical mass. It may be time to rethink, how do we approach, these type of global events? I mean, to your point, Eric, earlier, there are websites that show, decrepit, aging and venues that at one point were, these sort of temples of athletic greatness, and now they're like glorified cat boxes, or they don't even exist anymore. They're falling apart. All these past Olympic venues that were not able to be turned into something useful for the community. But at the same time, there are examples of whether it's an actual physical facility or a program, or a legacy type of program that do exist, coming out of games like this. I mean, I know, again, just referring really quickly to Los Angeles, we have a facility called the Expo Center, which is right outside of the Los Angeles Coliseum, the stadium, the location for the opening ceremonies, for those Olympics that were hosted twice. And, we just I'm with a group called Angel City Sports that does adaptive and Paralympic sport. programs. And they just staged a Paralympic Day there. And that facility was one of the benefits and the legacy of the 1984 Olympic Games, right? It's wheelchair accessible. It's there for the community. It's a free facility with gorgeous, gyms and a pool and weight rooms and locker rooms and, and a soccer field. And this is open to the public 24/7 for free, so it's hard to say that it's all bad, because when you look at a facility like the Expo Center in Los Angeles, you realize, like, look at all these kids that are learning how to swim and learning to play soccer and play wheelchair basketball and sitting volleyball. This is part of the legacy, that a city can benefit from.
Eric, do you mind if I ask Lori a quick follow-up really quickly?
Go right ahead, please.
So,
this is the conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear this a lot, that we should just scratch the Olympics because they cost too much, but it only costs what it's worth to a host, right? And again, as I was mentioning in a different context, there are some governments, regimes that want to invest in sport for reasons that might not be rational to advance other agendas. And so my question to you is, like, are you optimistic that there might be a bit of a self-correction here to bring things back into balance and preserve what's positive, both for the community, but also for the global audiences of an Olympics? A colleague at Slate wrote that, Paris in 2024 is going to be like the cheapo Olympics. And it actually, he meant it in a positive way, because there's some really great plans for just kind of having the great city itself be the host and using the city, and not necessarily feeling like everything has to be. And then you have LA coming up again, and Brisbane. Are you optimistic that we might have sort of a self-correction where the numbers might become more rational and might be more sustainable?
Yeah, I am very optimistic about that, and I'm hoping also, because of the selection of cities, when we were in the moment that the deal for Paris and LA, was crafted, some people had weird feelings about that. Well, I don't know, naming those two cities so far out. But what that has done, it's allowed cities to prepare, further in advance, right? And I think that there will be a bit of a course correction. I think also because this pandemic has forced everybody to, like, grind to a screeching halt and reevaluate the priorities, right? As far as whether it's priorities as an athlete training or the hosting organization committee, or even the sponsors involved. Now, again, whether you're a part of that Olympic family of sponsors or the larger, dare I say, wider breadth of sponsors that are sponsoring national federations and athletes, and and are not necessarily part of the official Olympic family or Paralympic family, this has forced everybody to sort of take a pause and reevaluate, okay, what part of our campaign or what part of our strategic priority is the part that we want to focus on next. And so that will, as many companies as are making that evaluation, are going to be that many different approaches coming forward. So maybe we will see, sort of a balancing out of, okay, what part can we play in the hosting of the games? Because there may be more support coming for these cities from really, places that we didn't think about before. Tourism was a big deal, in the world of global sport before the pandemic started. It came to a screeching halt, when everybody couldn't travel anywhere, but it's going to come back, right? Because, travel and the wanderlust effect, it's still there. People want to get back out in the world, right? So I do think that there's a bit of optimism. And then also when you look at Paris celebrating the heritage, now we're coming back into a cycle of cities that have hosted before, right? And hosted multiple times, and when you look at sort of the heritage that Paris is kind of infusing, they've already done into their bid, but they're listening to their communities. They've changed a couple of locations and venues, which they publicized, based on feedback, from the communities that were either scheduled to host or who desperately wanted to host, right? Los Angeles is focused squarely on how much money they've infused, millions of dollars, more money than has ever been infused before, into the creation of youth programs, social justice programs, things that will support, the actual game. The games themselves, dare I say, might be the secondary, focus to how much of a legacy can they build on the legacy that was already built from 1984. Brisbane, I know a lot of people have some concerns about, that was, that was a rigged bid, or, it actually wasn't. Brisbane really wants to host these games for the same reasons that other cities want to host. They want to showcase everything that they have to offer. Australia has a strong history, with not only hosting games, but with their athletics performance. We've seen the Australians, I mean, whether it's swimming or athletics or rowing, and then obviously in beach volleyball, the Australians, returned to the games for their men for the first time, I think, in like 21 years or such, and they made it back to the podium with the women. So I think in looking ahead, my optimism comes from the fact that the cities that are bidding, now for games moving forward, there will probably be fewer cities in the mix, right? But the cities that are bidding are laser focused on the reasons why they want to host, right? And so for that reason, I think there's a lot of, potential benefit that can come from that. I'm very optimistic about it, but obviously with a little bit of caution, right? We don't know what's going to happen with this pandemic, how long it's going to last, and how it's going to affect potentially Paris. Paris is only 3 years, away, right? This is a shortened, very unusual, quad, and what will the travel conditions be like? What will the ability to have spectators? How many spectators? We don't know any of this yet. We're optimistic, but with caution.
There's an obvious running theme here of the impacts of the pandemic. But one of the things that goes along with that, and I think Fred said it well earlier, is it gives us an opportunity to reassess, rebuild, reimagine sport in a way that is hopefully more equitable, just, and creating more just and equitable world. Of course, with that, there's a risk that it actually exacerbates those inequities, which is why I think conversations like this are really important, that we're thinking about these issues and planning for those issues. And with that, I want to turn it to Fred. Fred, you mentioned earlier public-private partnerships and relationships and the importance of those. So maybe you can connect some dots for us here. Beyond Sport is focused on community sport. What is the role and the connection of elite level sport and for-profit sport? Or are those things related? Are those completely separate items and we don't even belong in the same conversation? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question. I think in terms of so you have the sort of professional sporting landscape and then sort of the private sector. And I think from a private sector perspective, their stakeholders, their consumers, their fans are the most active and demanding that they've ever been, and that's young people, but also older people in terms of their demands of what they consume and who they support. And so, from a private sector perspective, the stats are out there. Various Nielsen reports around consumers choosing more sustainable brands, more responsible brands that are taking a stance, and that's where we've seen huge campaigns from the private sector, especially within sport. Obviously, Nike have been huge around athlete activism and supporting the athletes, but they've come into trouble as well. It's a complicated space. They haven't got it right all the time. And so, it trickles down into the communities, into their stakeholders, into their consumers. And so there's a very clear link for me in terms of where, what the influence is from a business perspective over these organizations. I think from a professional sporting landscape, again, your fan base is absolutely crucial to who you are as an organization, and your athletes are as well. And we can speak about athlete activism and what we've seen through various issues last year: pandemic, BLM, LGBTQ rights, mental health now, especially post Olympics. You have to take a stance and you have to be active in this space. And whether you're a governing body, whether you're a professional team, whether you're a league, we've seen work being done, and some have done more work than others. And I think, the Olympics is the absolute beast of all beasts, and they've had their challenges as well within this context. And, from once they took a very simple stance of what they claim was sort of no protest, but they've realized that they have to change that model. It's not fit for society anymore. And so they're going through that process. Now, you can have your own opinions on whether they've done enough or not at this point, but there's clearly development happening from that perspective. And so this piece around sort of the combination of a more demanding society, whichever way you look at it, shareholders, stakeholders, fans, consumers, with this connectivity towards the issues that we understand our communities are facing, becoming more and more connected. And organizations are being found out, and other organizations are taking a stance. And so it's a very interesting space to be observing and being a part of. And obviously a lot about what we're trying to do is shine a light on the positive, whilst really advocate for those to sort of advance the stance that they're taking and understand that they have a responsibility to do so.
So kind of a follow-up on that, what would you like elite for-profit level sports folks to know about community sport?
So I think been really interesting to see, like the likes of UK Sport here, which is the funding body in the UK for elite athletes, have done a lot of work around, what is a medal worth it? Like, what is the cost of winning a medal? And what does that really mean? And I think they're going through a process there to identify, actually, this is more than medals. There's a greater sort of piece at play here. And so I think I think your question initially was about what do you think professional sports role is to play, right? Is that what you asked?
Yes.
I think they absolutely have a role to play in serving their communities. And I think you've seen many leagues in the US really get this right. And you look at the likes of the NBA and their connectivity to social justice and racial justice, they take a very clear stance on that. And you've seen the platforms and the coalitions and the funding, of course, funding is absolutely crucial, that they do. And obviously the WNBA equally with the female game, some of the most vocal and activists in the US are within sporting infrastructures. And so I think their responsibility is to amplify support and to essentially advocate and make clear statements as to what they stand for and what they believe in. Now, the sort of the challenge there is you've got, to some extent, certainly with global organizations and global brands, you naturally have a more diverse audience. You have a more diverse group of stakeholders and fans that have contrasting morals, and where they sit on certain scales is massively different. So you have this essentially a sort of a clash of desires of sort of capitalism coming to a head with the sort of desires of social progress and justice. And so I think that's where we've seen, understandably slow, organizations not quite getting it right, and arguably not quite doing enough.
So
Eric, can I just add something really quickly
please.
to that? I think I'm 100% in agreement with Fred, on the organizations not getting it right, and in some cases not doing it enough, even as they try to scramble to figure it out. But what I want to highlight too is that some of the athletes are getting it right, because we have some athletes that through their actions, are demonstrating, that they get it, and they're trying to find a solution. A couple of examples, and I'm not going to use names in it because there's so many different examples, but you've got some athletes that not only do they, take a stand on the field of play, but they go back to their own communities, or communities where they were raised, or where they play sport, and they're doing things like that have nothing to do with sport, right? Buying school supplies for kids in the neighborhood, offering to buy meals for homeless or individuals that that are in between, transient at this point. So there are lots of other ways that some of the athletes themselves are showing through their examples, right, through their actual actions, right, speak louder than words, right, that old adage, that they're getting it right. And so hopefully what will come from that is the companies that they're involved with, because we need everybody on board. We need all the companies to be a part of this, right? Not just one or two. We need them all to be involved. So hopefully, as these athletes start to demonstrate their understanding and their actions, they're companies that are invested in them, and not just sponsors, but invested, right, in what these athletes are doing, will continue to support. And in that way, the communities will also benefit. I've seen lots of food drives and education support, and even creation of schools, in places that there aren't, there either isn't a school available or there aren't enough schools available, but these actions by the individual athletes themselves are really demonstrating exactly how important the athlete voice is, but also the athlete action, after the voice. And that's a big benefit that it was already there, but again, now it's been magnified because of the circumstances, of the pandemic and the fact that our attention is so focused, in these different areas now. So I think that's, this emergence of athlete activism is more than just on the field of play, right? It's actually unfolding in bits and pieces, outside in the communities, and it's there. We need to see more of it, but it's definitely there.
I dropped a link about LeBron James and community development, but to Lori's point, this is bigger than LeBron James. There are a lot more athletes doing this type of work. Obviously, LeBron gets a lot of press because of who he is, but this is bigger than LeBron James. So we've brought up issues, or actually I should say, athletes have brought up issues, and we've responded to them in this chat around, mental health, and Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka, gender inequality, NCAA women's basketball, women's national soccer team here in the US, and equal pay, racial justice. To what extent is or should be sport an agent of change versus to what extent is sport just responding to society? And I'll just open that up to anyone who wants to take a stab at that.
Well, I'm going to take, I just had this conversation with another group of folks, but I think that sport can be the agent of change here, because sport is something that is commonplace, to a lot of people, whether you come from, I have lots of friends who play professional sports outside of the US, right? And the one thing that, that they all have in common is they say, it doesn't matter if you don't speak the language. If, my teammates welcome me with open arms and I'm the last one in the drill so that I can see, what they're doing, but the communication comes on the field of play, not just verbally or not just, in a written sense, so sport is something that, again, that interconnectivity, between us all, right? I work in a lot of different countries and don't speak a lot of different languages, but when you come down to the group that's, working on a shared event, whether for me it's volleyball or beach volleyball or sitting volleyball or, golf or whatever, you find those common, sort of like common threads that bind you together. And that's something that sport can do, right? Whether you're running or if it's individual sport or team sport, there's something about the participation in the activity itself that connects you to the other people that also enjoy, that sport.
Yeah.
I agree. Just one really quick point is, sport breaks down barriers, right? It doesn't matter who you are, what side of the divide you're on. If you're on a football pitch, a soccer pitch, a baseball field, it doesn't matter who you are, you become part of a team, dynamic. And so that in and of itself is such a unique opportunity to be leveraged. And when leveraged, our belief is when leveraged with intent, has just unimaginable opportunities to address such a range of issues. And I think, when I think about examples, there's not many dynamics where you could be engaging a group on the border of Palestine and Israel, or a group of separate gangs in Chicago, but I know that it happens through sport. And so, what's the opportunity there, and how can that connectivity be leveraged and supported on a larger scale whilst being locally implemented? And I think, when we think of the likes of the IOC and these large committees and large organizations that are hosting, mega sporting events, these legacy strategies and the conversations that we've touched on are such huge opportunities for these organizations. And I think absolutely being grounded in the communities in which you're hosting will be what stands you, away from the rest. And Laurie touched on LA84 and the work they've done. London during the Olympics was without doubt the greatest time London, I think, will ever be, and the UK will ever be. And sadly, we've gone quite significantly backwards since then, but these are the times that stick with people, and sport has that capability. And so that's the stuff that gets me excited talking about this, because there is there's such a wealth of opportunity, and education for those organizations that are trying to find their place is really the place to be focused.
Well, I think that I was going to say, I think there's also a huge opportunity here, for sport to be a change agent in terms of safeguarding. I talk about that a lot. I've just joined the board of trustees of the UK-based Safe Sport International charity, and one of the reasons why I joined is because I work around the world in different sporting events, and I've seen offenders in the United States popping up with national teams and national programs outside of the US. And there's very little communication or coordination, between the athletes or the coaches or the federations. And so when you talk about, we've talked about the rise of athlete voice, the importance of cities, wanting to commit to staging these large events. Well, what about keeping all of the participants safe? Right. And this is where I think sport can really become a change agent. Like, for example, what is the word for safeguarding or safe sport in other languages? Some languages there isn't one, right? And so when we look at sort of the auxiliary effects, of sport at any level, right? Whether you're on the fields with little kids or in the stands at the Olympics, the common thread is, how can we continue to utilize sport to create change, especially when it comes to preventing abuses of the people involved, right? I mean, it's a little bit of a heavy topic and could be its own panel, but the athletes are really the ones who are leading this charge, right? I mean, you look at with gymnastics, US gymnastics finally has this reckoning, of abuses that were happening, I mean, terrible abuses, and that sets off British gymnastics, Australian gymnastics, volleyball all over the world, basketball in Mali. I mean, it's, the communication and coordination of this athlete voice and the activism, aspect of it can really lead to some significant changes outside of the world of sport. And one of those areas is protection of people who participate, right? Who consume this content that we're talking about, these billions and billions of dollars worth of investment and content and, and coordination. Well, how do we keep everybody safe, right? Who's a part of that community? And sport can help spread the word because it's something we all have in common, right?
So I think that naturally leads to the question of power. Anytime we're talking about social change, there's an issue of power. And I'd love to hear from all three of you on this. So, Fred, I'm going to start with you, and just a question about how sport can reshape power. And I want you to talk about your Youth Advisory Council. Andreas, I'd love to hear from you, and however you want to address the question, particularly around capitalism and the whole mess that is, professional sport and how capitalism is intertwined in this. And then Lori, about the athlete voice, particularly at the elite level and national sport governing body. But Fred, why don't you tackle this first? What's the role in sport in challenging and reshaping power? And why did you start a Youth Advisory Council?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about youth, and I think there's so many opportunities there. So I'll come on to that. But I think if you look at the last sort of 16 months, the people that have made the greatest impact are leaders who have taken a stance and done something differently. And they've done that through new approaches in light of these issues that are being faced. Like, we weren't looking for and needing old style leadership. We needed new, innovative leaders. And they're the ones that we think about when we think about those that have shone in the last year and a half, those that have shone at the Olympics. It's actually away from the competition, personally, where my strongest memories lie off the back of this competition. And this is met with that young generation, which is more active and demanding than we've ever seen. And so I really think the work that's being done by NGOs on the ground is therefore getting amplified, acknowledged, supported by athletes, as Laurie mentioned, led by athletes in many occasions, but also, the average person in the community down the road is really understanding the role that sport played before, the pandemic, for example, and now is how crucial it is after. And so I think that is met very crucially with those in certain positions of power from a funding perspective, from a influence perspective, by a more demanding consumer base, and an opportunity that sport and the private sector is seeing from a business perspective to benefit and have profit from doing good. And we are very comfortable with that being a very important thing, and to advocate for that shared value model. And so when you think about certain dynamics within sport, and again, some stats that sort of jumped out to me is rights holders with sustainability agendas are expected to see an 11% increase in sponsorship revenue in the next 3 to 5 years. I've seen this personally with several Premier League clubs have generated millions of pounds worth of sponsorship in the last 2 years. Tottenham, Southampton, each have incredible sustainability strategies. So there's a business case for this. And then from an athlete advocacy perspective, hugely increased engagement levels when messages are being promoted and supported from a social impact perspective and from a sort of social justice perspective. So these are business opportunities. And I think the key for us as an organization from an advocacy perspective is to highlight these opportunities. Firstly, because it will naturally, garner more interest, but it'll also be more sustainable, and shifting away from this sort of ad hoc philanthropic model where funding comes and goes in cycles. It's not sustainable. The CEO of one business one year loves rugby, the next year loves hockey. What we're looking to create is models that organizations can see sustainability in and benefit from, and therefore influence them to work towards that model. And so I see our role within the sport and development sector to make that case, and make that case pretty clear. And I think it's pretty compelling, but I'm certainly biased.
We were having such a great conversation. I can't believe you had to bring in Tottenham. Come on.
Hey, I'm with you. I'm an Arsenal fan.
Oh, good to hear.
They do good on the sustainability front. I can't argue it.
We were talking about, we've been talking a lot about, just going back to the last segment, we've been talking a lot about sport as a microcosm of society. But I also think, a lot of, what we're kind of getting at is that it's also a magnifier, right? Because not just because sport is sort of a common language that crosses borders, as Lori was alluding to, but it's also something that people care passionately about. And it's participation, the obvious answer to is sport good is, at a very basic level, and we just sort of take this for granted, the participation in sport makes us healthier. And so that's, there's nothing that's going to compete with that good. But sport fandom and the sort of community and identity that create that, and the way sport connects us to each other and to our geographies, and that is, it can cut both ways, right? In general, I'm a huge proponent for that interconnectivity. The United States has a history of being isolationist and believing in this American exceptionalism, and we wanted to play our own sports. And we would proclaim the winners of a domestic league world champions having won a World Series. That is absurd. And I think one of the great things about the rise of soccer in the US and the rise of the US within the world of soccer is to make, younger, generations of Americans more connected to the rest of the world and appreciate that the entire universe doesn't revolve around the United States. And you have kids now growing up who can point to the map that there's a Barcelona, there's a Korea because I watched in the World Cup, and it's not all, their entire worldview isn't determined by, the map of NFL divisions and conferences. And I think one of the, an amazing kind of data point in terms of showing how globalization is taking off in sport is the fact that the Euros final, prior to the Olympics, the Euros tournament in Europe, obviously in Europe, had more TV viewers in the United States than the final game of the NBA, championship that included our Phoenix Suns. That is remarkable. I don't think people appreciate that. 500,000 more people watched Italy play England in the final of a tournament that the United States was not even participating in the United States than an NBA final. That's just remarkable. So, and this weekend with the opening of the seasons in Europe, NBC, ABC, CBS, they're showing English leagues, Italian leagues, German leagues. The other thing I want to say about this force of good is I think that the access of women to sport and the increased visibility around women's sport is just one of the great stories of sport in the last generation. I mean, it's, this Olympics featured 49% female athletes. In talking about the importance of media earlier, the reason why the NWSL and the Women's League in soccer league, football league in England has momentum is because, media companies have come in and acquired those rights, and if you can't watch these games, they're not going to grow. So I find that very encouraging. I grew up in Mexico, and it's just amazing how attitudes towards women in sport are changing, but it's still lagging. The Mexican delegation that went to the Olympics was sort of 2/3 female, when the one that went to Rio was about 1/2, female. So, but I think as you're exposed to a more global perspective, that's what starts changing attitudes in places. But we can't pretend that it's all positive, because again, if people's feelings are magnified through sport, it's going to be the good and the bad, right? So there's been a lot of commentary and analysis of how the diversification of sort of like the national teams in Europe have changed attitudes and improved attitudes in many ways towards comfort levels with the multiracial society. And this was, most obvious when Zinedine Zidane won France a World Cup, right? And what that meant for the North African diaspora in France. And you see that English team this summer. It's amazing. But at the same time, you also see a lot of, with our platforms being what they are and social media, you also see a lot of racial abuse, coming to the forefront. So it's a mixed picture, and also sport tends to bring us together. But, I also read that the fact that Taiwan beat China in doubles badminton, because, this is a sport that others care a lot about, and it's fantastic, right? But the fact that Taiwan beat the PRC, or Chinese Taipei, as it's referred to in the Olympic movement, seemed to exacerbate tensions between the two places, in that rivalry. We used to see this in the Cold War context in the States with, going up against the Soviet Union. So, I think we have to see, this isn't just a reflection of society. It magnifies all the tensions. It magnifies all so, I might take a knee for social and racial justice in my, game with friends, but that's not going to have the same meaning as when it's on these, platforms that people care so viscerally about. So it's a place where all of the social debates, all the geopolitical debates that we have as societies really play out in a way that more people engage with them. And that's why it's also a great opportunity. Marcus Rashford and, NBA players speaking out on these issues, they just have a much bigger platform and megaphone to do so. And so as Fred and Lori have, I would, I think we can't avoid but applaud that athlete activism. Last thing about the Olympics, which we have to mention because this is an Arizona State event. And speaking of globalization of sport, our athletic collegiate conference of the Pacific, the Pac-12, the Pacific Athletic Conference, had it been a nation competing at the Olympics, I saw it would have ranked 5th in the medal count. When you take all of our athletes, current and alums, obviously they were representing many countries. And, ASU, for instance, had 20 former and current athletes represented the Olympics, 19 of them representing other countries. Our colleague, Victoria Jackson, wrote a great column about this for The Athletic, showing, kind of like analyzing how the U.S. collegiate, sports infrastructure has become sort of the great Olympic development machine for so many countries because it's so competitive, because it recruits, student athletes from all over the place. And it's largely, in a way financed by U.S., college football and men's basketball. So it's kind of an odd cross subsidization there. But, an Olympics, 40, 50 years ago, you had athletes coming from all over the world. And it was this amazing encounter of people who had never met, different cultures. There's still an element of that, but oftentimes, the 4 or 5 track stars representing countries on different continents, they all competed against each other, last year in the Pac-12 or, the SEC or the Big Ten. So that's just another indicator of how the world has shrunk. And again, I think largely in a good way. But there are always going to be frictions that are going to play out in sport too, because it is what people care about and governments care about. And so there's always going to be that corruption, that manipulation. You know, you saw the tension with the Belarusian athlete in Tokyo. And then we find out that the head of the Belarusian Olympic Committee is the son of the dictator, and, you know, brought back memories of Saddam Hussein's, you know, Olympic Committee. It was his brother. And so, you know, sport federations at the national level, and Lori will know this far better than I, are sort of the crown jewel, the plum asset that a lot of these regimes have, because they know how deeply people care about sport. And that again connects as to why, you know, Vladimir Putin wants to host these big events, and why, you know, my first World Cup that I watched avidly was the 1978 World Cup in Argentina, which was presided over by a military junta that was engaging in a dirty war against its own society back then. But it hosted this World Cup to sort of, you know, elevate its prestige with its people and distract from the horrors that were happening. So that's always going to be unavoidable at some point, because we all have this relationship with sport that is so powerful.
Great. So we've just got about 3 minutes left before we wrap up, and I want to make sure we get to our final question. And it's a big question, and I'm going to ask you to be quick on a big question, so apologies. But how do you see the role of sport going forward in the future on a global scale? And I'd love to hear just quickly from everybody. So we'll Lori, Fred, then Andreas, you can bring us home. So Lori, how would you get to that?
In a word, accountability. You know, everything that Andreas just said and Fred just said, and we've been talking about in this whole thing, it comes down to accountability. You know, and for me, it's the accountability from the international federations, from the IOC, from the IPC, from the Pro League, you know, all the owners. It's accountability moving forward, right? So how do we take everything that we already know, the pros and the cons, and balance that out in a way that's more transparent, more communicative? You know, how do we rely more on the benefits of globalization of sports instead of getting trapped, you know, in the downsides, right? And, you know, Andreas mentioned corruption and manipulation. You know, we're one of the few national governing bodies in the world that's not part of a junta regime, dictatorship, government controlled, you know, financial state-sponsored doping program or whatnot. But is our model the best model? No, we've proven that, you know, because there is indeed a lot of generational corruption and, you know, generational, like we've always done it that way, right? That's the thing that, you know, the two catchphrases I've heard the most in the last 2 weeks is, well, the world is catching up, you know, with us, right? How arrogant to say, you know, the world is catching up with us, but then also, well, we've always done it that way. Okay, well, if the world is catching up and we've always done it that way, it's time to hold ourselves accountable and fix the process moving forward.
Great, thank you. Fred, what's the future hold?
Yeah, I think to build on accountability, I think authenticity as well. I think, you know, when used with intent, sport has an incredible ability to impact people positively. And I think we have to start with the needs on the ground locally of our societies and our communities. And so it has the reach, as we've discussed, and has grown exponentially, has come to the fore in the face of the pandemic. And so I think authenticity, taking a stance, building it based on the needs of your society and the needs of your communities, and collaborating with organizations that offer something that you don't offer, and fill the gaps that need to be filled. I think, you know, whilst I suppose I feel like I've certainly spoken about a lot of sort of negatives in this conversation, but I am inherently very positive about where sport is placed right now. And I think the journey we've gone on in the last 16 months, the communities have seen huge hardship, but I think that reset ability to return to play more impactfully and to look at it more holistically is a huge opportunity. And so I'm very excited to see where it can go, but it has to be authentic and it has to be with intent.
Yeah, great. So we've got accountability, authenticity. Andreas, in 1 minute, what's the future hold?
I like those, and I would sort of add, I'm torn between accessibility and connectivity. I don't think the commercialization and the growth and the money sloshing into professional sport and into these big sporting events is necessarily bad. It is providing more access. I mean, I can get off this call and watch the English Premier League, but I think it's very important that we remain connected with the grassroots level, and that regulators, if the leagues themselves don't do that, I think there is a need for regulation to maintain, the integrity and solidarity down sort of the pyramid, right? So that if I spend tens of, billions of dollars to host an Olympics, as Lori was saying, the community benefits. If, I'm a big club and I'm buying, paying a transfer fee for a player for 100 million pounds, you see these figures that are absurd. I want there to be, that sport be held accountable so that some of those monies go back to the community groups that help develop those players, and that continue to expand access to community engagement and to the players at the rec levels in underprivileged places that aren't necessarily going to play professionally. But I think sport needs to think holistically about, I've heard about these amazing community fields that Manchester City has built in Mexico through its foundation, and we need a lot more of that. So accessibility, interconnectedness, I'll go with accessibility.
Great, so we've got accountability, accessibility, authenticity, and connectivity. I think that's a fantastic way to end. I believe Kendall's going to jump back on here and wrap us up, but as she's doing that, I want to thank you all for your time and your insight and wisdom. I know I could have this conversation with each of you for hours, and the hardest thing for me is not to continually ask you questions because you have so much wisdom and insight. So I really appreciate you as well as all our attendees who logged on. I think I can say confidently, we all believe that sport has the power to change the world for good. And I'm thankful for all of you. Encourage us all to continue to do that work. So thank you, and I'll turn over to Ken.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our host, Eric Legg, and each of our panelists. Thank you so much. To the attendees, we do want to share with you a little bit more information. So if you just hold on tight, but to our panelists and to our host, if you need to jump off to your next thing, I know that you've got a lot of busy schedules. Thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation. So for our attendees, we did tell you about our newest GSM our newest GSM issue, which we have linked into the chat box. And we do want to share with you just a short clip of a documentary by Pamela Johnson, The Sea is Our Garden, and give you a little bit of a teaser into the issue. So Brendan, if you don't mind giving us that teaser video.
Been to Africa, there's thousands of miles of coastline, and there's just these massive rivers that dwarf the Mississippi and the Ohio River, like the Gambia, the Volta, the Niger. You had all of these African societies developing along these rivers and along this coastline.
The way that they interact with the water here. Every morning, people are at the beach, they surf. They play football here. So they fish. They do any number of things that include swimming, that include their interaction with water, but they don't have the same types of general fears of the water as we have back in the States.
My family and I came up with the idea of Black Kids Swim in 2015. And we credit it to our daughter, Raven, who's a championship swimmer. We were on the way back from one of her summer swim meets, and she Googled the phrase Black Kids Swim on her phone. And all she came up with was stories about negative stereotypes about how Black people do not swim.
And I was like, maybe you should do something. And then my dad helped on, like, yeah, Ebony, why don't you do something? So then she did it. She made Black Kids Swim, and it's grown a lot.
I saw an op-ed in the Washington Post, and it was about an increase in drowning in Dakar, a city that's literally on the water. And it really hit me to know that because kids were losing their places to play because of the rapid economic development that's happening here, that they were playing on the beach increasingly and drowning. There was a ton of questions that bubbled up because of that article. So my family, my husband Ed, and our 2 kids, we got on a plane and we came out just to see what we have learned in the work of Black Kids Swim. People grow up in Jamaica and Haiti and Australia, and they still have an issue with drowning. It's a global issue.
Pour être nageur, il faut passer par plusieurs étapes. Il faut la familiarisation, après, il faut être un tétard, après tétard, il faut être un dauphin, dauphin de bronze, dauphin d'or, ainsi de suite. On est obligé, ces enfants-là, de les faire même le secourisme. Et sont des enfants sauveteurs. Parce que là, le problème de la noyade au Sénégal, bon, tout le monde sait que ça pose problème. Et voilà, il y a une future qui peut vraiment, à l'avenir, aider le Sénégal à parer ces accidents-là. Depuis 86 à nos jours, chaque année, on forme 150 maîtres nageurs.
So we encourage everybody to definitely click through, read the stories, and watch the rest of that wonderful documentary from Pamela Johnson that's really about connecting communities back to the water. So with that, we thank you so much for joining us on this GSM Live, and we can't wait to connect with you again at our next one. Have a wonderful day.